Jerusalem, Wednesday night, roughly 3 days before the crucifixion, and if you could have stood above the city and watched every moving piece simultaneously, what you would have seen is 3 different groups of people moving through the same streets, all of them circling toward the same event, none of them communicating with each other, and every single one of them playing a role that had been written down in prophetic texts centuries before any of them were born, without a single one of them knowing it. Most teaching about the crucifixion focuses on Jesus fulfilling prophecy, and that is accurate, thoroughly documented, and worth studying. But there is a layer underneath that layer that almost never gets taught. The question that rarely gets asked is not just whether Jesus fulfilled prophecy, but who else was fulfilling prophecy simultaneously, without knowing it, without intending to. And what that says about how God executes a plan that has been centuries in the making, that is the angle this video is going to take. The prophets had described this sequence with a specificity that is genuinely difficult to explain away. Zechariah, writing around 520 BC, described 30 pieces of silver being paid in a temple context and then thrown to a potter. The psalmist, in Psalm 22, described soldiers casting lots for the garments of a man being mocked while dying. Isaiah, in chapter 53, described the servant being assigned a grave with the wicked, but ending up with the rich in his death. These were not vague thematic descriptions. They were procedural, detailing specific actions, specific locations, specific amounts, specific objects. And the people who would fulfill them centuries later had no awareness that they were the subjects of those texts. If this kind of depth in biblical prophecy is what you're after, subscribe to this channel. This is where we go past the surface of the texts and look at what they actually say. Here is what makes those 3 days different from any other prophetic sequence in the biblical record. The central inversion that sits at the heart of this video. Every agent who thought they were exercising free judgment across those 72 hours, Judas calculating his price, the chief priests managing their crowd control problem, Pilatus trying to preserve Roman order, the soldiers dividing property at the foot of a cross, was, from the perspective of the ancient texts, completing a sentence that someone else had already started, not metaphorically, not thematically, procedurally, verbally. The word used for the action, the amount specified, the location identified, all of it landing exactly where the texts had placed it. It is worth pausing to notice that this pattern of prophetic fulfillment through unwilling participants is not unique to the crucifixion. It runs through the biblical record as a consistent template. Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery with full intent to harm him, and that slavery became the mechanism by which Joseph was positioned to save the ancient world from famine. The exile of Israel to Babylon was not accidental. It was described in advance, including the specific king who would authorize the return. The pattern established across the Hebrew scriptures is not that God overrides human agency. It is that human agency, operating freely, lands precisely where the sovereign design placed the target. What makes the final 3 days before the crucifixion unusual within that pattern is the density. Multiple prophetic texts fulfilled simultaneously by groups who were not coordinating with each other, who in some cases were actively opposing each other's agendas across a compressed 72-hour window. That density is what demands attention. A single correspondence between prophecy and event might be coincidence. The stack of correspondences across those 3 days requires a more considered explanation. Jerusalem was full that week. Josephus records that during Passover the city could swell to more than 100,000 pilgrims beyond its ordinary population. The streets crowded, the temple courts managing the sacrifice preparations, the Roman garrison on heightened alert, because large Jewish gatherings during religious festivals were exactly the kind of environment where nationalist tensions could break into something the prefect would have to explain to Rome. Into this environment, three separate dramas were unfolding simultaneously, and none of the participants had access to each other's scenes. If what you are finding in this video is opening something for you, write in the comments, "I am not alone." Because the pattern this sequence reveals is that nothing, not timing, not circumstance, not the choices of people who meant you harm, operates outside the design. Write it now and stay with us. It was Wednesday night when Judas left. Matthew 26:14-16 describes the meeting with a brevity that is itself remarkable. 4 sentences covering what was arguably the most consequential private negotiation in human history. "What will you give me if I hand him over to you?" The chief priests counted out 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment, Judas began looking for an opportunity to hand him over. What the text does not give us is extended inner monologue, anguished deliberation, a catalogue of Judas's reasoning. It simply records the question, the response, and the outcome. A transaction. The chief priests were not thinking about Zechariah when they counted out the silver. They were thinking about a timing problem. Matthew 26:5 records their explicit concern. Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people. Judas was a solution to a logistics challenge. The amount of money they paid was the standard compensation available under the law. Exodus 21:32 establishes 30 pieces of silver as the payment owed when a slave is gored by an ox. It was not a large sum, it was a standard sum. Administratively, this was a routine transaction. That is exactly how they would have experienced it. Zechariah 11:12-13 is worth reading carefully because the correspondence with Matthew's account is not thematic, it is specific. The prophet writes, "I told them, if you think it best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it. So they paid me 30 pieces of silver, and the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they valued me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them to the potter at the house of the Lord." 30 pieces, a temple context, a potter, a tone of bitter irony from God about the valuation. Zechariah wrote this around 520 BC, roughly 6 centuries before the Wednesday night meeting in the chief priest's chambers. The correspondence is not only numerical. The Hebrew verb in Zechariah 11:12 for they paid describes the physical act of weighing out silver, shakal, shakal, a verb associated with measured payment. The word Matthew uses in 26:15 for what the chief priest provided carries the same gesture, counted out, measured, weighed. When Judas asked, "What will you give me?" and they responded by counting out 30 pieces, the action they performed was the action the prophet had described, not approximately, but in the specific vocabulary of commercial measurement. The standard objection to this correspondence is worth engaging directly. Wasn't 30 pieces of silver simply the going rate for a slave in that period, making the number coincidental? The answer is yes, and that is precisely the point. Zechariah was not describing a unique amount. He was describing the standard minimum valuation available under the law. The prophet presented the 30 pieces as the measure of contempt, the handsome price, as he put it with undisguised irony, that the leaders of the people placed on the shepherd God had sent them. The specificity was not in the rarity of the number. It was in what the number represented as a statement about valuation. That same Wednesday night, a few hundred meters away, a woman broke an alabaster jar of expensive perfume and poured it over Jesus' head. Matthew 26:6-13 places this event immediately before the Judas negotiation. The perfume was worth approximately 300 denarii, roughly a year's wages for a laborer. 2 acts of valuation in the same city on the same night, one placing Jesus at the standard legal minimum for a slave, one placing him at a year's worth of labor. Matthew records them back to back, and in Matthew's account it is immediately after the anointing that Judas goes to the chief priests. The text does not explain the connection. It presents the sequence. If you're still here, take a second and like this video. It helps other people find what you just found. And what you're about to see in the next section will show you how the pattern deepens across Thursday night into the early hours of Friday. Thursday evening, someone in Jerusalem had already prepared the room. Mark 14:13-15 records Jesus sending 2 disciples forward with specific instructions. Find a man carrying a jar of water, a distinctive detail, since women typically carried water, making a man with a water jar identifiable in a crowd. And follow him to a house where the owner would show them a large upper room already furnished. The room was ready before the disciples knew they needed it. The preparation had preceded the need, and the resources had been arranged before the request was made. The disciples at the table that night heard everything Jesus said, and John 13-17 records what may be the longest single teaching unit in any of the 4 Gospels, 5 chapters of uninterrupted discourse covering the Holy Spirit, the nature of what was about to happen, the promise of return, the commandment to love one another, and the prediction of the disciples' own scattering. All of it was spoken directly to them. All of it was heard. And Luke 24:8 records what happened after the empty tomb. Then they remembered his words. The understanding did not come the night it was given. It required the vantage point of the other side of the resurrection to unlock. That is the most theologically precise detail of Thursday. The information was complete, delivered in full, to people who were not yet in a position to receive it in the register it required. This is not a criticism of the disciples' intelligence or their faith. It is a description of something the texts suggest consistently. That comprehension of what God is doing frequently requires the perspective that only arrives after the event. The disciples on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24 were not unintelligent people who had failed to pay attention. They were people who needed the resurrection vantage point before the prophetic thread became visible to them. Then the garden. The arresting party came in the night with torches, weapons, and a Roman detail alongside the temple guards. John 18:3 specifies that a detachment of soldiers was present, which suggests Roman involvement in addition to the temple guard. They came prepared for resistance. What they encountered was not what they had planned for. John 18:6 records one of the most unusual details in the entire Passion narrative. When Jesus identified himself by saying, "I am he," the entire arresting party drew back and fell to the ground, episan chame. The text does not explain the mechanism. It records the effect. Trained soldiers and temple guards fell backward in the presence of the man they had come to arrest. The arrest was not a capture. Jesus asked them again who they were looking for. They said, "Jesus of Nazareth," and he responded, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." John 18:8. The conditions of the arrest were being set by the one being arrested. He identified who should be taken and who should be released. He negotiated the terms of his own surrender in the middle of a military arrest operation. Isaiah 53:7 describes the servant as one who did not open his mouth. But John's account shows something more precise than silence. He spoke, he answered, he directed the outcome. What he did not do was resist or flee. The surrender was active authorization, not passive acceptance. "Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" John 18:11, Jesus' response when Peter drew his sword. The word cup at that moment in the evening was not a casual figure of speech. Hours earlier, at that same table, Jesus had lifted a specific cup and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." He had also told them explicitly that he would not drink from the fruit of the vine again until the kingdom. A statement that only makes sense in the context of a Passover Seder with 4 cups. the last of which he had deliberately left undrunk. When he used the word cup in the garden, the disciples who had been at that table were hearing it in a specific liturgical register. The garden prayer was not resignation, it was active acceptance of what the cup contained. The resources you need to go deeper on any of this, on the prophetic background, on the historical context, on the texts that sit underneath these 3 days, are linked below. Take a moment to check those out, and then stay with me. Because what Pilatos does on Friday morning, with 30 pieces of silver already paid, and a verdict he cannot quite bring himself to deliver, is where this prophetic sequence reaches its most precise and most unexpected correspondence. 6 trials in less than 12 hours, that is the procedural reality of Friday morning. Annas first, the former high priest with residual political authority, then Caiaphas, the sitting high priest, then the full Sanhedrin, which required a session after dawn to make the proceedings technically legal, then to Pilatos, the Roman prefect, because the Sanhedrin had lost the authority to carry out capital punishment under Roman occupation, then to Herod Antipas, because Jesus was Galilean, and Herod happened to be in Jerusalem for the Passover, then back to Pilatos for the final decision. 6 hearings. Under Roman criminal procedure, trials were not conducted at night, not conducted before dawn, and certainly not repeated before the same magistrate. The urgency the chief priests imposed on the timeline was deliberate. They needed the verdict delivered before the Passover sacrifice began, before the city fully woke up, before anyone could organize a public challenge to the proceedings. Pilatos is one of the most textually documented figures across the Passion accounts, and one of the most theologically flattened by common readings. The standard presentation places him as a reluctant man who knew Jesus was innocent. He said so explicitly, multiple times, using the Latin formula for legal acquittal, and executed him anyway for political reasons, to avoid a riot and to preserve his relationship with Rome. That reading is accurate as far as it goes. What it does not account for is the prophetic layer that runs underneath the political layer, because the political decisions Pilatos made in those hours produced something the prophet Isaiah had described 7 centuries earlier. Isaiah 53:8 describes what happened to the servant. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. The Hebrew phrase is meotzer v'mimishpati, literally, from restraint and from judgment, meaning the legal protections that should have been available were systematically removed from him. Pilatos declared Jesus innocent 3 times. He offered to release him under the Passover pardon. He sent him to Herod specifically to find a reason to let him go. He had Jesus flogged, a brutal intermediate option, hoping it would satisfy the crowd without requiring an execution. Every mechanism of the Roman legal system that could have produced a different verdict was activated and then overridden by political pressure. The servant was taken away through a judicial process from which justice was deliberately excluded, which is what the prophet wrote. Pilatos washed his hands in front of the crowd. Matthew 27:24. The gesture was not Roman. Roman law had no ritual of hand-washing as a declaration of legal innocence. That is not a Roman legal practice. The gesture was drawn from Jewish tradition, specifically from Deuteronomy 21:6-7, where the elders of a city wash their hands over an unsolved murder and declare, "Our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it done." Pilatos reached for a cultural gesture that belonged to the people he was ruling over, perhaps because he knew his crowd would understand its meaning. Perhaps because something in him needed to perform it. What he may not have understood is that the gesture, in its original Torah context, was designed for circumstances where guilt was genuinely unresolvable. He was performing it in a circumstance where he had already resolved the guilt. He had declared the man innocent. The hand-washing did not accomplish what he intended it to accomplish. The response from the crowd in Matthew 27:25 is one of the most theologically weighted sentences in the entire Passion account. His blood be on us and on our children. This is often read as a self-curse, a mob's reckless declaration in a heated moment. In the context of the Jewish legal tradition, however, it reads as something more formal, a declaration of blood guilt in the language the law recognized, a statement that the responsibility for this death was being accepted by those making the declaration. Whether it was intended as a legal formula or as an expression of confidence that they were doing the right thing, the language they chose was the language of juridical acceptance of blood guilt. The crowd spoke in the register the law would have recognized without necessarily knowing that is what they were doing. The titulus, the wooden placard above the cross carrying the charge, was written in 3 languages: Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. John 19:20 specifies this explicitly. The text read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." The chief priests objected. They wanted it to read, "He said he was the King of the Jews," a subtle but significant distinction between a declaration and a reported claim. Pilatus refused. "What I have written, I have written." A Roman governor's administrative stubbornness about a sign's wording on a Friday morning, when he had already shown himself willing to bend to political pressure, becomes, from the perspective of the texts, a trilingual proclamation posted above the site of the crucifixion in the 3 dominant languages of the ancient Mediterranean world. The objection worth addressing at this point is reasonable. Isn't it too convenient to read prophetic fulfillment into decisions made for entirely mundane reasons? Crowd management, political calculation, administrative stubbornness? The response the texts themselves supply is not a theological argument about divine sovereignty, but a question about specificity. The question is not whether these figures were consciously thinking about prophecy. Of course they were not. The question is whether what they did matches what the ancient texts described, at the level of specific detail, specific vocabulary, specific sequence. And at that level, the correspondence is not thematic similarity. It is procedural overlap. The soldiers at the foot of the cross were following standard Roman procedure. The condemned man's clothing was the soldier's customary perquisite, their share of what the execution produced. They divided Jesus's outer garments into 4 shares, 1 for each soldier, but the undergarment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. John 19:23 records this detail specifically, and a seamless garment loses value if cut. So they decided to cast lots for it instead of dividing it. That was a practical decision about preserving the value of a piece of clothing. Psalm 22:18, written approximately 1,000 years earlier, had described this scene. "They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing." John 19:24 cites the psalm explicitly at this moment. He is the only evangelist who does. The soldiers were not thinking about Psalm 22. They were thinking about fabric. The people standing at the base of the cross and mocking, the crowds who had gathered as crucifixion attracted crowds, were responding the way crowds respond to public executions. Matthew 27:39-40 records them shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself." The gesture and the language track precisely to Psalm 22:7-8. "All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him." The crowds were performing a scene that Psalm 22 had already scripted. They were not reading from the psalm. They were generating behavior that matched the psalm, because the psalm had described what crowds do when they see a man dying in circumstances that appear to have disproven his claims. From the cross, Jesus cried out in Matthew 27:46, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani." my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is Psalm 22:1. In first-century Jewish practice, citing the first verse of a psalm was the standard method of invoking the entire psalm, the way a modern congregation might recognize a well-known text from its opening phrase. Every rabbi, scribe, and Torah-trained individual within earshot of those words would have known immediately which text was being referenced, and Psalm 22 does not end in abandonment, it ends in vindication. Verse 24, "He has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help." Verses 27 to 28, "All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him." The words spoken from the cross were not only an expression of anguish, they were a citation that carried its own conclusion embedded within it. Two audiences were receiving two different signals from the same words at the same moment. The people who knew Psalm 22 heard the opening verse and knew where the text ended. The people who did not know the psalm heard only the opening, only the cry. What was spoken from the cross was, simultaneously, a declaration of complete desolation and a prophetic citation that pointed toward vindication. The same words, two entirely different frames for receiving them. The darkness that covered the land from noon until 3 in the afternoon is recorded without explanation in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The texts do not say what caused it. They simply record that it happened. Amos 8:9, however, had written, "In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight." The prophets used cosmic disruption as standard prophetic language for moments of divine intervention in human history. It appears in Isaiah 13, Joel 2, and Ezekiel 32 in contexts of major judgment events. What the crowd at Golgotha saw as a weather event, the prophetic tradition had placed within a specific category of divine action. At the moment Jesus died, the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Matthew 27:51 records this with a detail that is often glossed over. It was torn from top to bottom, not from bottom to top. That directional specification matters because a tear initiated from the bottom of a 60-foot curtain would have required a human agent working from below. A tear from the top required something else. The curtain in question divided the holy place from the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber of the temple, which only the high priest entered alone once per year on Yom Kippur, with elaborate precautions prescribed in Leviticus 16. The tear made that restricted space visible. What Leviticus 16 had governed in intricate detail was suddenly without its boundary. That is what the text records. What that means theologically is what the letter to the Hebrews would spend several chapters unpacking in the years following. The centurion who commanded the execution detail made a declaration in Matthew 27:54. Surely he was the Son of God, a Roman soldier, pagan background, professional executioner, not part of the covenantal conversation the Passion narrative had been conducting all week. And yet the first person in Matthew's Passion account to explicitly declare Jesus' divine identity is this man, not a disciple, not a Jewish leader, not a scribe who had studied the messianic texts. A Gentile military officer at the moment the execution he had supervised concluded. The irony of the sequence holds through to this detail. Isaiah 53:9 contains a specification that is, taken on its own, difficult to explain as anything other than prophetic knowledge of a specific event. The text reads, "He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death." The first half is what Rome typically produced for people executed as criminals, a common grave, or exposure, or disposal in the valley of Hinnom. This is almost certainly what happened to the two men crucified alongside Jesus. The second half, with the rich in his death, describes something that required an intervention. Joseph of Arimathea appears in Matthew 27:57-60 in his only appearance in any of the four Gospels. Matthew identifies him with one specific word, plusios, rich. He was a wealthy man who had become a disciple of Jesus, and he had already prepared for himself a new tomb cut from rock in a garden near the site of the Crucifixion. What he then did required a series of voluntary actions, each carrying a cost. He went to Pilatus personally to ask for the body, a political risk, because publicly requesting the body of an executed man aligned you with that man's cause. He took the body and prepared it himself, which created ritual impurity before the Passover. And he placed the executed man in his own personal tomb, a significant resource voluntarily given. None of this was legally required. All of it was chosen, and all of it fulfilled the second half of Isaiah 53:9. The difficulty with Isaiah 53:9 is not the theological interpretation, but the historical specificity. The text does not say near the rich or associated with someone wealthy. It says, with the rich in his death, a preposition that specifies location and association. A rich man, acting voluntarily, with a tomb already prepared, positioned near the execution site, available on the day the timing required, the day before the Passover Sabbath, when burial needed to happen quickly. The convergence of these conditions is either a remarkable intersection of circumstance or the execution of something the prophet described without having any natural mechanism to know it would unfold in exactly this way. Nicodemus arrived with 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes, John 19:39-40, a quantity appropriate for the burial of royalty, not the burial of an executed criminal. Two men who had been private followers, one with the tomb already prepared, one with burial materials proportional to the dignity of a king. Both appearing at the precise moment their specific resources were required within the narrow window the timing allowed. The text offers no account of how they coordinated. It simply records that they were both there with what was needed at the moment it was needed. The tomb was sealed with a large stone and assigned a Roman guard detail, Matthew 27:62-66. This detail is historically unusual. The chief priests and Pharisees remembered that Jesus had predicted he would rise after 3 days, and they were concerned enough about that prediction to take official precautions against it. They asked Pilatus for a guard. Pilatus granted it, and Roman soldiers were posted at the sealed entrance. The theological irony is acute. The people who took the resurrection prediction most seriously in the days immediately following the crucifixion were the people most determined to prevent it. They secured the evidence against their own position. Those guards would become the first witnesses to the empty tomb. Step back now and look at the full 3 days from the perspective of the prophetic texts simultaneously. Zechariah 11:12-13, 30 pieces of silver, the temple context, the potter's field, fulfilled by a group of religious leaders solving a crowd management problem. Psalm 22:18, soldiers casting lots for clothing, fulfilled by soldiers following standard property procedure. Psalm 22:7-8, mocking with head-shaking and rescue language, fulfilled by a crowd responding to a public execution. Isaiah 53:8, justice deliberately withheld, fulfilled by a Roman prefect navigating a political crisis. Isaiah 53:9, buried with the rich, fulfilled by a wealthy disciple making a voluntary and costly decision. These are not thematic resemblances between ancient poetry and historical events. These are procedural correspondences, specific actions, specific vocabulary, specific sequences, specific locations. These prophetic texts were not written by the same author in coordination. Psalm 22 is attributed to David, written around 1000 BC. Isaiah 53 was composed around 700 BC, in a different historical context, addressing a different political situation. Zechariah 11 was written around 525-18 BC, after the return from Babylonian exile, in yet another distinct moment in the history of the people. 3 different authors, 3 different centuries, 3 different sets of historical circumstances from which each text emerged, none of them written as a coordinated description of a single event. And yet the final 3 days before the resurrection brought all 3 threads to convergence in a 72-hour window, fulfilled by people who were not coordinating with each other any more than the prophets had been. The disciples did not see this in real time. Luke 24 gives us the clearest picture of what the followers of Jesus understood in the days immediately following the crucifixion. The 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus said, "We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." Past tense. Their hope had been placed in a specific category of prophetic expectation, the conquering Davidic king who would restore the political sovereignty of Israel, and the crucifixion appeared to have disproven that expectation. The thread running through Psalm 22, through Isaiah 53, through Zechariah 11, was not the thread they had been following. They had been following the kingly thread. The suffering servant thread was in the same texts, but they had not read it in the same register. The chief priests and Pharisees, by contrast, had a more acute awareness of the resurrection prediction than the disciples did in those days. Matthew 27:63 records them saying explicitly, "We remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.'" They remembered it. They took it seriously enough to secure the tomb with a guard, which means, in the days between the crucifixion and the resurrection, the people who were most actively engaging with the prediction were the people who were posting guards to prevent the outcome. They knew the text. They did not recognize that they were inside it as agents, not as observers. Judas had the texts available to him. Every Jewish man of his background would have known Zechariah. The question of whether he recognized himself in Zechariah 11:12-13 is one the Gospels do not answer directly. What they do record is his response after the verdict was delivered. He returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests, said, "I have sinned, for I have betrayed innocent blood," and the chief priests took the coins, and consulting together, decided they could not put blood money into the temple treasury, so they used it to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. Matthew 27:9-10 cites this explicitly as fulfillment of the word spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, though the quotation draws more closely from Zechariah 11 than from Jeremiah, a textual detail that has generated scholarly discussion for centuries, and one that the text itself does not resolve with a clear explanation. The potter's field. Zechariah had written, "Throw it to the potter at the house of the Lord." The chief priests, deciding they could not keep blood money, used the 30 pieces to buy a piece of land associated with a potter. The field was in the valley southwest of Jerusalem. Josephus and later early Christian sources locate Akeldama in that vicinity. What began on Wednesday night as a private financial transaction in the chief priest's chambers ended with those same coins purchasing a specific piece of land in a specific location that matched the prophet's language precisely. The money moved from the disciples' shared funds to Judas, to the chief priests, and finally to a potter's property, tracing the exact trajectory the text had described. There is a question that sits underneath this entire reading, and it is worth engaging because it comes up consistently when this subject is taught. If Judas, Pilatos, the chief priests, and the soldiers were fulfilling prophetic scripts, what does that say about their responsibility? If the outcome was determined in advance, were they really making choices? Matthew 26:24 holds both realities in the same sentence, without attempting to resolve the tension between them. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him, but woe to that man who betrays him. It would have been better for him if he had not been born. The prophetic necessity and the moral accountability are stated simultaneously. The text does not offer a philosophical resolution. It presents them as coexisting realities. This is not a contradiction unique to the Passion narrative. It is a pattern that appears throughout the biblical record. In Genesis 50:20, after years of slavery, Joseph says to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Two different intentions operating simultaneously through the same action. The brothers' intention was genuine harm. The outcome was preservation of life. The intentions did not produce the same result as the intentions themselves contained. The intention of the agent and the outcome produced by the action are not required to be in alignment with each other. They can operate in opposite directions simultaneously. What this says about the 3 days before the crucifixion is not that the participants were automatons executing a fixed program without genuine choice. It is that their genuine choices, made freely for their own reasons, within their own frameworks of understanding, converged on a specific outcome with a precision that the ancient texts had already described. Judas chose. The chief priests chose. Pilatus chose. The soldiers made a practical decision about a garment. Joseph of Arimathea chose to go to Pilatus and ask for the body. Each choice was real. Each choice was free within its own context. And the aggregate of those free choices produced an outcome that matched 6 centuries of prophetic description in specific detail. Romans 8:28 is sometimes reduced to a general promise that everything will work out fine. Paul's actual language is more precise. The word translated works is synerge, synergizes. The prefix syn means together. God is working together with all things, including the things that appear to be working against the outcome, toward good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. This is the pattern of the final 3 days made into a theological principle. Not that opposition disappears, but that opposition, operating freely according to its own logic, is incorporated into the design rather than standing outside it. Friday looked from the inside of Friday like the end of something. The disciples who had been with Jesus for 3 years scattered, Mark 14:50. Then everyone deserted him and fled. The one who had negotiated the betrayal hanged himself, according to Matthew 28:5. He went away and hanged himself. 4 words that close out his presence in the narrative. The guards stayed at the tomb through Saturday. The stone was in place. The seal was official. The chief priests had taken every available precaution. From inside Friday, from inside Saturday, the question of what would happen next appeared to have been answered by the evidence already visible. The 3rd day, as a pattern in the Hebrew Scriptures, is worth pausing on, because Jesus cited it directly as the framework for understanding what would happen. In Matthew 12:40, he pointed to Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. But Jonah is not the only instance. Abraham and Isaac traveled 3 days to Moriah. Genesis 22:4 records that on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. The text does not describe what happened on days 1 and 2 of that journey, only that the 3rd day was when the situation resolved. Esther fasted 3 days before approaching the king, Esther 4:16, and the 3rd day was when she went in. The pattern of 3 days in the Hebrew Scriptures functions as a structural marker. This is the distance between the moment that appears to be the end and the moment that reveals what was actually happening. The women who went to the tomb on Sunday morning were operating within the frame of Friday. They were not going to witness a resurrection. They were going to complete the burial preparations that the Sabbath had interrupted. Mark 16:1 records that they had bought spices to anoint the body after the Sabbath was over. They were working within the logistics of death, following the standard obligations of the burial tradition. What they encountered at the tomb required a frame that Friday had not given them, and that they had not yet been able to hold on to. The angel's words in Matthew 28:5-6 are careful about the frame of reference. "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen just as he said. Kathos epen, just as he himself said." The angel pointed them not to the prophetic texts, but to the direct words Jesus had spoken. The prophecy and the personal word had been saying the same thing. The angel chose the more immediate frame. The word Jesus had given them directly, in his own voice, as the primary reference for understanding what the empty tomb meant. The entire sequence, from 30 pieces of silver counted out on Wednesday night to the empty tomb on Sunday morning, is the biblical record of what it looks like when a plan that was being written across 15 centuries of prophetic text arrives at its moment of execution. Each agent played their specific role without access to the full script. Each detail landed exactly where the ancient text had placed the target. Zechariah wrote about 30 pieces and a potter's field. Someone else would spend them. Isaiah wrote about justice withheld and burial with the rich. A Roman prefect would withhold the justice, and a wealthy disciple would provide the burial. The psalmist wrote about lots cast for clothing. Soldiers who needed to preserve the value of a seamless garment would provide the method. If you're sitting with this in a moment that feels like inside the sealed Saturday, where something you were trusting seems to have reached its conclusion, where people who were supposed to protect you made the specific choice you feared, where the evidence visible to you right now appears to settle the question against you, the 3 days before the resurrection are not an ancient story that has nothing to do with your present. They are a documented pattern of how God executes his purposes through precisely the circumstances that appear to work against them. 30 pieces of silver, a transaction motivated by contempt, a potter's field purchased with the coins of betrayal, a seamless garment divided by soldiers following procedure, a rich man's tomb provided by someone making a voluntary and costly decision. Nothing that mattered in those 3 days was left to chance. Nothing that fulfilled the ancient text happened outside the precision of the original design. The guards at the tomb were the last irony of the sequence. They were posted to prevent the resurrection. They were stationed at the location where the resurrection would occur. Matthew 28:4 records their response when the angel appeared. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The men deployed to prevent the event became the involuntary witnesses to it. They had not intended to testify, they had been positioned to suppress, and yet the logic of the 3 days was consistent from Wednesday night through Sunday morning. The mechanisms used to prevent the outcome produced the witnesses who could not explain it away. There is something the disciples would later describe that clarifies what the 3 days meant from the inside. In Acts 2:23, Peter preaches at Pentecost and says that Jesus was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and that the same people who did the handing over put him to death by nailing him to the cross. Both realities in the same sentence, again. God's deliberate plan, human agents choosing and acting. Peter did not experience those two things as a contradiction. He had watched the events of the 3 days from the inside, had scattered in Gethsemane, had denied Jesus 3 times at the fire, had seen the sealed tomb, and had come out on the other side of the resurrection with a framework that held both things simultaneously. The thread was visible, the agency was real, the design was deliberate, the agents were responsible. 3 days, 3 overlapping dramas that none of their participants could see in full. Zechariah, David, and Isaiah, writing across 6 centuries, had described in specific detail what none of them would live to see, and none of the people who fulfilled their words knew they were doing so. The final 3 days before the resurrection are not primarily a tragedy. They are the most precisely documented case in the biblical record of what it looks like when a sovereign plan moves through human agency toward an outcome that human agency was not in a position to prevent, even when human agency was specifically trying to. If what you found in this video is speaking to you right now, write in the comments, "Jesus, you are my peace." Because the pattern of those 3 days is not only a historical record, it is a declaration about the nature of the one who designed it. Write it now. Share this video with someone who needs to see what sits underneath those 3 days, and we will see you in the next one.